Section 1. The long journey begins. The cold breeze of the Rockies whispered through the dense trees, its gusts weaving between the towering pines like secrets shared by ancient spirit. The rugged landscape stretched out before me, untamed, quiet, and beautiful in a way that only wild places could be. It had been a long journey to this point, both physically and mentally, and I found myself standing at the foot of the mountain, looking up at the path ahead. I had always been drawn to the wilderness. There was something about the isolation, the sense of being removed from the noise of the world, that pulled me in. It was a call I couldn't ignore. But this trip, this hike, wasn't like the others. It wasn't about seeking solace or reconnecting with nature. There was something deeper, something darker that had been pulling at me for years. You see, it all started back when I was just a kid. My dad, a man of few words but strong convictions, always spoke of the Rockies with reverence, as if they were alive with stories that could only be understood by those who walked their paths. He'd tell me about his younger years, hiking through these very mountains, searching for something he could never fully explain. Years passed, and my curiosity only grew. What was it that he had been seeking? What was it that had driven him into these wild, uninhabited areas of the Rockies? And then, one day, I found the map. It was tucked away in a box, buried under old journals and forgotten memories. It was a simple thing, yellowed with age, but the markings on it were unmistakable, a trail through the Rockies, leading to a remote, barely known spot deep in the wilderness. The destination was marked with a symbol, something that I didn't recognize but couldn't shake, a symbol that seemed to whisper to me, urging me to follow it. That's when I decided to go, to retrace his steps, to uncover whatever mystery had lingered in his past. I wasn't sure what I would find, but I felt that, like my father, I had to see it for myself. The first day of the hike was almost calm. The air was crisp, the sky clear. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the landscape. I had no specific destination for the night, just a general direction based on the map, but the trail was well worn enough that I didn't feel entirely alone. As I trekked deeper into the Rockies, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence around me. It was a peaceful silence, but it felt heavy, as if the land was waiting for something that hadn't yet come. The wind had died down, and the only sounds I could hear were the crunch of my boots on the dry earth and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a bird or squirrel. After a few hours, I came across a small clearing. The sun had now set, and the stars above began to make their presence known. The first sign of human life I'd seen on this trailer-weathered signpost. Half buried in the earth sat silently at the edge of the clearing. It didn't bear much of an inscription, just a faint engraving that was nearly impossible to make out in the dim light. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine when I stood in front of it, unsure if it was a sign of something waiting for me further along the path or a warning to turn back. I decided to press on. If there was something here, something that my father had come for all those years ago, I had to find it. By the time I set up camp that night, the air had turned cold. I sat by the fire, its warmth flickering against the growing darkness, and my thoughts began to wander. Was I following in my father's footsteps? Or was I walking into something darker, something that had been waiting for him, ... And now, for me. I tossed another log onto the fire, watching the flames leap higher. The only sound now was the crackling of the fire and the occasional wind gust. The chill in the air grew more pronounced, and the forest around me seemed to grow quieter with each passing minute. I lay back against my sleeping bag, staring up at the stars above. There was something haunting about the Rockies at night, something ancient and timeless. The same feeling that my father must have felt when he made this journey so many years ago. But as I lay there, alone in the vastness of the wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something or someone was watching. Section 2. The sign in the forest. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and though I tried to sleep, the feeling of being watched wouldn't let go. Each time I closed my eyes, a shadow seemed to crawl at the edges of my mind. Not loud or sudden, but subtle, constant, like the forest itself had eyes. Eventually, I dozed off for what couldn't have been more than a few hours. I woke to the faint, echoing sound of something dragging. The sky was still dark, but hints of dawn began to stretch across the trees. I stepped out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and scanned the surrounding woods. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the crisp morning chill. But there were marks on the ground, faint lines etched into the dirt near my tent, like something had been pulled through the clearing in the night. Whatever it was, it hadn't come from the direction I'd hiked in from. The tracks led deeper into the woods, toward the path marked on my father's old map. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. It could have been a bear or an elk, anything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. After breaking camp and covering up the remnants of the fire, I followed the trail. The marks were erratic, sometimes vanishing altogether, only to reappear a few yards later. It was enough to keep me hooked, enough to keep me moving forward. And then I saw it. Half hidden behind the underbrush was an old wooden sign. Time had not been kind to it. Moss crept along its surface, and the carving was barely legible, but I could still make out the same symbol I'd seen on my father's map. A circle with a vertical slash down its center. It looked like a crude eye or maybe a door. Beneath it, in smaller letters, was a single word: return. I stared at it for a long time. What did it mean? Was it a warning, a message, or perhaps both? The air felt different now, heavier. I moved past the sign and noticed how the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, darker, their branches entwined like gnarled fingers. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the usual forest sounds, birds, insects, even the breeze, faded into silence. It was here that I began to notice things that didn't belong. Pieces of fabric caught on branches, aged and faded, a rusted canteen wedged between two rocks, and eventually a boot-hold, mold-covered and half-buried in the soil. My heart sank, not because I knew whose it was, but because I realized someone else had come this way, and they hadn't come back. As I pressed further, the trail narrowed. It eventually opened into another clearing, smaller than the last, but far more disturbing. There were stones arranged in a circle in the center, covered in moss and scratches that looked almost like runes. Some were symbols I recognized from the map. Others were completely foreign to me. I didn't dare step inside the circle. My instinct screamed at me not to, so I skirted the edge, watching, waiting. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakably human. He never left. I spun around, flashlight beaming into the trees. Nothing, just branches swaying gently in the wind. Though I hadn't felt a breeze, I backed away slowly, eyes scanning every shadow. There was no one there, but the voice had been real. It sounded close, almost like it had been spoken from inside my own head. Shaken, I left the clearing behind. I continued along the trail, deeper into the mountains, and I began to wonder, what exactly had my father been following when he first came here? What had he seen? What had he heard? I thought of the sign again, return, but I wasn't turning back. Something was waiting for me, and I intended to find it. Section 3. The map and the warning. I woke early the next day, the air still and cold, my tent slick with dew. For a moment, I lay still, listening. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, like the woods were waiting. watching. After breakfast, I took out my father's map again. I hadn't looked at it closely since the night before, and in daylight, some of the stranger elements became clearer. His notes were scrawled in faded pencil its names and symbols I didn't recognize. There was one marking, though, that stood out. A circled X with the words "Don't go alone" written beside it. I compared the map to my GPS coordinates and realized I was headed right toward it. I hiked for hours, the terrain growing rougher, the trail thinner. This wasn't a path anyone used regularly. It was overgrown and littered with fallen branches. Birds didn't sing here. The occasional rustle came from the underbrush, but otherwise it felt lifeless. Around midday, I found something I hadn't expected: an old campsite, nearly invisible under years of moss and leaves. The tent poles were snapped, and what looked like a rusted-out lantern lay beside a tree, half buried in soil. Inside the collapsed tent, I found a notebook. Most of the pages had been ruined by moisture, but a few entries were still readable. The first one was dated August 12, 1996. That stopped me cold. That was the same summer my father went missing. The entries were brief, but unsettling. Arrived near the stone face. Something followed me last night. Saw lights in the trees. Not fire, not flashlights. Movement. Dreams getting worse. Can't sleep. Hearing voices in the wind. If I don't come back, don't let anyone else follow. And at the bottom of the last readable page, a sketch. The same symbol from my father's map. A circle, slashed through with a jagged line. I folded the notebook carefully and tucked it into my pack. Not long after, I came to a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. Trees grew dense and tall on either side, but the valley itself was oddly bare, as if something had swept through and cleared it. And right in the center, a structure. At first, I thought it was a cabin, but as I hiked closer, I saw it wasn't made of wood. It was stone. A single-room stone shelter with no windows, no markings, just a door hanging open. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to keep walking, but curiosity won. I stepped inside. It was dark, colder than outside, and smelled like earth and damp rock. There were no signs of occupation or furniture, no tools, just bare stone and a single carving on the far wall. The same symbol, the circle with the jagged slat, and beneath it, more faded writing. Not in English, not in any language I recognized, but it gave me a headache to look at. The letters seemed to move if I stared too long. Then I heard something, a whisper, very faint, coming from deeper in the valley. I stepped outside quickly, scanning the trees, nothing. But when I looked back at the stone hut, the door was closed. I hadn't touched it. There was no wind, no sound, just the door, now shut behind me. I didn't try to open it. I didn't want to know what was inside. I turned and left the valley, moving fast, trying not to run. As I climbed back up the ridge, I glanced back one last time and saw something watching me from the trees across the valley, too tall, too still, and gone when I blinked. I made camp hours later, far from that place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left it behind. That night, I dreamed of stone walls and a door slamming shut behind me, and the whispering came from inside my own head. Section 4. Eyes in the tree line. I stopped for the night earlier than planned. I hadn't made much progress, but I was drained not from exertion, but from the constant weight of unseen eyes. It wasn't paranoia. I knew that now. Something out there was aware of me. The clearing I chose was tight, hemmed in by twisted evergreens and sloping rock. I set up the tent quickly and tried not to think about the figure I'd seen, or the laughter, or the whisper in the circle. But as the fire crackled to life, I felt the trees staring, not metaphorically, literally. It took me almost an hour to notice them. Dozens of trees surrounding the clearing, each with deep, hollow knots positioned just about eye level, all perfectly round, all facing in. At first I tried to rationalize it. Just an odd coincidence of nature, maybe. But it didn't hold. There was a pattern to them, a deliberate orientation, like they were meant to observe. And then one of them blinked. Only for a second. Just a flicker of movement. But it was enough. I backed toward the tent, flashlight scanning from trunk to trunk. Nothing moved. Not again. But I was sure of what I'd seen. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, watching the tree line. And somewhere deep in the forest, something watched back. Around midnight, the fire sputtered into a dull glow. That's when the noises started. Not animal sounds, something different. A rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on bark. Soft, slow, and spaced out in an unnatural cadence. I grabbed the flashlight again, swept it across the clearing. Nothing. Just trees and branches and silence between the taps. Then the tapping stopped, and something whispered. It wasn't words. Not exactly. More like wind weaving through empty rooms. But the sound had intention. It rose and fell, as though forming phrases. I couldn't understand it, but I knew it was speaking to me. I sat frozen for minutes that stretched like hours. Finally, I stepped out of the tent again. Slowly, carefully, and in the beam of the flashlight, I saw that the forest floor had changed. There were footprints, dozens of them, human-sized, some barefoot, some in boots. They circled the camp, overlapping each other in a chaotic ring, like people had come right up to my fire and danced around it in the night. Only they hadn't left any noise. No broken branches, no voices, just prints in the soil. And at the center of the circle where my fire had been was a pile of stones, arranged in the same symbol ID seen on my father's map. A circle with a slash through it. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat up in my tent, flashlight in hand, heart thudding in my ears. Occasionally, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting between trees. Once, I swear I saw a pair of hands grasp a trunk, then pull back out of view. But the worst part came just before dawn. I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, slow, not animal, something by. They came from the northern edge of the clearing, paused, then resumed. Each step closer and closer, until they were just outside the tent. I held my breath. Didn't move, didn't blink. A shadow fell across the tent wall. Tall, thin, wrong. And then it leaned closer, until its hand-long, spindly fingers pressed against the fabric, just inches from my face. I don't know how long we sat like that, me holding in a scream, it breathing, yes. I could hear it breathing outside. Then, without a word, it stepped away. The light of dawn crept in moments later. I emerged shaking, expecting to find prints, drag marks, anything. But there was nothing. The stones were gone. The footprints erased. The forest had reset itself, as if to say, "You imagined it, but I know better." I packed up camp and continued the hike, not because I was brave, but because turning back would have meant passing through that same clearing. And I couldn't go back, not now, not ever. Section 5. The missing people file morning came slowly, dragging a thick fog with it that wrapped the trees like gauze. I packed up my gear mechanically, my thoughts still tangled in the strange stone hut and that unnerving whisper. The symbol was haunting me. It had appeared in too many places now to be a coincidence. It was on my father's map, in the old notebook, carved into that hut. It was a thread, and I had no choice now but to follow it. I decided I needed a break from the wilderness. I hiked to a nearby ranger station marked on my topographical map. It took nearly 6 hours to reach it, a squat wooden building with a faded flag out front and smoke curling from a small chimney. An older ranger named Bill greeted me at the door. He was wary at first, but warmed up once I explained I was retracing my father's old hiking route and doing some family research. I asked him if he'd ever heard of anything strange up here, disappearances, odd symbols, anything about a stone hut in the valley. His expression shifted, like I'd crossed some invisible line. He looked over his shoulder, then waved me inside. "Over coffee," he told me. "This land eats people. Always has." That stuck with me. I showed him the notebook and my father's map. He stared at the symbol for a long time and eventually pulled out a large manila envelope from a locked drawer. Inside were dozens of old missing persons reports. Hikers, campers, backpackers. Some as recent as a few years ago. One name caught my eye, Suzanne Culver. I nearly dropped the file. I knew that name. She was the girl from the picture with my dad, the one Winston said had gone missing in the 70s. Her file was thin, just a single-page incident report and a grainy photocopy of the photo I had. Bill noticed my reaction. "You knew her?" "No," I lied. "Saw the name before?" He went quiet, then said, "Her case was weird. She was camping up past Bear Lake, never came back. Her boyfriend, only suspect, walked out of the woods alone, screaming about things in the trees. RCMP took him in, let him go. No body, no evidence." I asked if that boyfriend's name was Markand. He nodded. My stomach dropped. That was my father. I didn't tell Bill. I thanked him, took a few photos of the files with my phone, and left. I hiked until dark, barely noticing the terrain. Mind racing. Why had Dad never told anyone? Why had Mum reacted so violently whenever I brought him up? The fog thickened as I set up camp. My fire wouldn't catch. My hands were trembling. Something had shifted. That night, I didn't sleep. There were footsteps outside my tent, soft, deliberate. They circled for hours. When I finally unzipped the flap at dawn, there were no tracks. But the notebook I'd found was gone. In its place, carefully centered on my sleeping bag, was a scrap of paper, the symbol, drawn in fresh charcoal, and underneath it, written in shaky block letters, "Go back. This isn't yours." I burned the paper, packed, and hiked south, but every mile I walked, I felt like I was being herded, not retreating, but redirected. Whatever this was, it wanted me to keep going, and I was starting to understand why Dad had never come home, because something out here didn't let go. Section 6. The voices in the pines. By mid-afternoon, the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, taller and darker, their trunks thick and bark flaking like sunburned skin. The air felt heavier, and my footsteps seemed muffled by the thick moss that carpeted the ground. I'd planned to veer west and circle back toward the trailhead over the next 2 days, but my feet kept pulling east, toward the ridgeline that marked the deepest part of the reserve. I told myself I'd just go a little further. Around 3 p.m., I found an old signpost. Most of the words had rotted away, but one arrow remained, burned into the wood. Ravine. I checked my GPS, no mention of it. My father's map had it, though. A thin, twisting red line leading straight into a gash in the terrain. It felt like stepping into a story I hadn't finished reading. The descent was steep, the slope slick with moss and crumbling shale. Trees arched over me like a cathedral ceiling. The farther I went, the less I heard. No birds, no insects, not even wind. The silence was thick, like a pressure in my ears. Then I began to hear them. Voices. At first, it sounded like murmuring a low tide of words that never rose above a whisper. I thought it might be wind, or maybe water echoing off the rocks. But when I paused to listen, the sound stopped. And when I walked again, it followed. Not just one voice, many. They weren't speaking any language. I knew it was like chanting or humming, layered and rhythmic, but disjointed, like each voice was stuck in a loop of its own, some fast, some slow, all of them wrong. At the base of the ravine, I found something that made my blood run cold. A circle of stones, perfectly arranged, each one marked with the same jagged slash symbol. In the center sat a pile of charred wood and blackened bones. Human? I backed away slowly, heart pounding. The chanting grew louder. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, scrambling up the ridge until my legs burned and my throat felt raw. The voices chased me, rising in pitch, until they hit a shrill crescendo, then stopped. Just like that, when I reached the top of the ridge, I collapsed beside a tree and tried to catch my breath. I told myself I was imagining it. Stress, sleep deprivation. But then I checked my phone. One photo had been taken. I hadn't touched the camera. It was a close-up of my face, taken from inches away, and behind me in the blurred background was a figure in the trees, pale, tall, watching. I deleted the photo and turned off the phone. But it didn't matter. I could feel them now, not just watching, following. That night, I didn't set up camp. I kept walking until I nearly passed out on the trail. And in my dreams, the voices returned. Only this time, they spoke in English. You're getting close. Section 7. The journal that wasn't there by the time I woke up the next morning. I felt more hunted than lost. I'd been out here for days, and while my body was beginning to wear down, my mind felt raw, like every nerve was being slowly peeled. Still, I pressed ease. The trail had mostly vanished now, reduced to occasional scuffs in the undergrowth, or the barest hint of boot prints. My father's map was all I had left, and even it had started to feel like a warning instead of a guide. Just past noon, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. A hiker's camp, abandoned, tent-shredded belongings, scattered across a flattened patch of earth. The air stank of mildew and something sharper like old copper. I sifted through the detritus carefully, trying to piece together the story. There were remnants of packaged food, a first aid kit still sealed, a tattered sleeping bag with a large, dark stain. But what froze me was the journal. It looked familiar, bound in cracked leather, the same color and size as the one my father had carried. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pages were blank, every single one, but I knew it had been written in. The corners were smudged with dirt and oil. There were indentations in the pages. I held one up to the light and tilted it, and a message emerged, faint as a ghost. Stop writing. I flipped further through the book, scanning for any more hidden text. One page near the center had been scratched over again and again until the paper was almost worn through. But under that, barely legible, was one sentence. He thought it would save her. I didn't know who he was. My father? Someone else? My mind circled like a hawk above roadkill, searching for meaning and finding only bones. I took the journal and packed it carefully. As I zipped up my bag, I noticed something carved into the trunk of a nearby pine. The same symbol, but this time it had a tail like a comet, or something falling. That evening, the forest changed again. The trees thinned, and I found myself at the edge of a clearing I didn't remember seeing on any map. In the center was a fire pit, long, extinguished, surrounded by a circle of small wooden figures. Crude, childlike, each had a different shape: a deer, a bird, a man with outstretched arms. All of them faced inward. In the middle of the ring was a stone, just one. But it wasn't like any stone I'd seen in the Rockies. It was black, perfectly smooth, geometric, like it had been carved not by nature, but by hand, or something else. I didn't touch it. That night, I dreamed of fire. I was inside the hut again, but this time it was filled with people, or shadows. They stood in rows, heads bowed, their bodies whispering. The symbol glowed on the far wall like a window into another place, and through it, something looked back at me. Something old, something hungry. I woke with blood on my hands. Not mine, not fresh. I washed them in a nearby stream, scrubbing until my skin was raw. The journal was still in my pack, still blank, but I swear, when I opened it later, it had one more page than before. A new one, at the bottom, in tiny, trembling handwriting. The truth isn't buried, it's waiting. Section 8. The cabin that shouldn't be there the next morning broke gently. The light filtered through the dense canopy like diluted gold. And for a while I let myself believe that everything I'd experienced up to that point, every whisper in the dark, every strange shape in the trees was just the wilderness playing tricks on me. But then I remembered the dragging sound. I didn't sleep well, not after hearing that, whatever it was. I'd heard it long after I'd extinguished my fire and zipped myself inside the tent. It hadn't been walking, it hadn't been running, it had been dragging. I couldn't explain it. The sound had been thick, heavy, wet. It echoed faintly through the trees, like something large was being pulled across the forest floor. Something that didn't want to move on its own. I broke down camp quickly. I didn't feel watched anymore, but the sense of being alone had left me too. There was something else in those woods. I didn't know if it was animal or human. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to keep moving. According to the map, I'd reach the base of a small ridge later that afternoon. If I kept pace, I'd be within range of a high-altitude meadow by sundown. My plan was to stay there for the night, take in the stars, and give myself a break from the oppressive canopy. The idea of sleeping under open sky had never sounded so appealing. But sometime around midday, as I followed an old game trail along a creek bed, I noticed something strange up ahead, a straight line in a place where nothing was straight. That's the kind of detail you learn to spot quickly in the wilderness. Nature is messy. Trees lean, rocks crumble, water bends and curls. So when you see a right angle in the woods, it stands out like a spotlight. At first, I thought it might be an abandoned ranger station or a backcountry shack. But when I got closer, I realized it was older than anything I'd expected. There was a cabin, a small, squat structure nestled among thick pines and overgrowth, so overtaken with vines and moss, it almost seemed like part of the landscape. Its walls were built from rough-hewn logs, weathered and warped. The roof sagged inward under the weight of time. No smoke came from the chimney. No footprints marked the soil. The weird part, this cabin wasn't on any of my maps. Not the paper ones, not the topographic overlay on my GPS. It simply wasn't supposed to be there. I hesitated before approaching. Everything in me said to keep moving. But curiosity, that quiet itch that had gotten me into more than a few strange situations, tugged at me. I couldn't help it. The door wasn't locked. It creaked open with a hesitant groan that seemed louder than it should have been, given the quiet. The interior was dark, filled with the scent of rotting wood and old smoke. Dust motes danced in the filtered light from a small window. Its glass cracked like a Inside were a few pieces of furniture, table, a stool, a rusted metal stove that hadn't seen fire in decades. There were tools hung neatly on the wall. A hatchet, a handsaw, and an old lantern blackened with soot. A few empty cans sat on a shelf. Everything was coated in dust. Everything, except for a journal sitting on the table. It was a leather-bound book, surprisingly well. No mold, no dust, just sitting there, as if someone had placed it recently. I picked it up, hesitated, and then opened to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, looped, written in black ink that had faded only slightly. The first entry was dated September 3rd, 1924. Arrived today. The hunting is poor. The air feels wrong here. Birds don't sing. Trees creak even when the wind doesn't blow. I read further, flipping through entries filled with more strange observations. How the shadows moved in unnatural ways. How a soft humming could be heard late at night from somewhere deep in the woods. And how the writer, a man named C. Langdon, kept finding dead animals arranged in ritualistic patterns around the property. Then, an entry dated nearly a month later. October 1st, something scratched the walls last night. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't whisper your name while they scratch. I stopped reading. I didn't want to see more. The journal had a weight to it, not just in the hand, but in the air. A pressure that felt like it pushed against the edges of my skull. I backed out of the cabin slowly and returned the way I came. I didn't run. I didn't need to. Whatever lived in that place had long since left. Or so I hoped. But the way the air had changed inside that cabin, the way my ears felt full like I was underwater, it reminded me that some places are meant to be left alone. Some stories are meant to remain unfinished. By the time I reached the clearing just past the ridge, I realized something else unsettling. I'd lost track of time. My watch said 3:24 p.m., but the sun was already well into its descent. I had at least 2 hours of hiking left to reach the meadow, but the temperature was already beginning to drop. I should have made camp then and there. I should have played it safe. But something about the cabin had stirred up an energy in me. Restlessness, a quiet anxiety I couldn't quite shake, and despite what I'd seen, or maybe because of it, I pushed on. The trees grew tighter the further I went. Closer together, darker. At one point, I turned to look behind me and realized the trail had disappeared entirely. I was walking between the trees, on memory alone. That's when I heard it again. The dragging sound. Only this time, it wasn't distant. It was behind me. Closer, heavier. I froze. Listened. There it was, again, like something wet and heavy being pulled along the forest floor. I turned, but the trees were thick and the shadows were deep. I saw nothing, and yet I felt it. A gaze, a presence, a thought not my own, whispered along the edges of my mind. I pressed forward, faster now. Not quite running, but no longer exploring. Just trying to put distance between me and the thing I couldn't see. By the time I reached the edge of the meadow, my legs were burning and my breath came in clouds. I stepped out into open sky just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting everything in a warm orange glow that felt more like fire than light. The meadow was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something with me from the forest, that somewhere behind the tree line, something was still watching. That night, I didn't build a fire. I ate a cold dinner and sat quietly in the dark, listening, not to the wind, not to the birds, but to the space between the sounds. Because sometimes, that's where the truth hides. And in that stillness, I realized something. The cabin may not have been marked on any map, but I was now. Something out there had noticed me, and it was waiting. Section 9. The voices in the cold. That night in the meadow was one of the coldest I'd ever experienced. Even though it was only early October, I'd checked the weather before I left. Unseasonably warm, they'd said. Highs in the 60s, lows just above freezing. But something had changed. Not just the temperature, either. The air itself felt thinner. Not in the way elevation makes your lungs work harder, but like the very breath of the forest had been drawn out. The fire remained unlit. I was too unsettled to gather wood, and even if I had, something deep in me whispered not to draw attention, not tonight. I sat inside my tent, wrapped in layers, the sleeping bag pulled up to my chin, my ears straining in the silence. There were no crickets, no owls, not even the wind dared stir the grass. And then just past midnight I heard them. Voices, faint at first, carried on the air like old radio static, barely there but unmistakably human. A woman's voice, then a man's, then something else. I pressed my ear to the tent wall. I couldn't make out words at first, just tone gentle, conversational, like someone talking just on the other side of the fabric. But there was no one there. When I finally unzipped the flap and peered out, the meadow was empty, but I could still hear them. They weren't getting closer, they weren't moving, they were just present, like a conversation caught in a loop, a memory on repeat. I stepped out, reluctantly, clutching my flashlight tight. The beam caught nothing but grass and rocks and a few weathered logs at the far end of the clearing. I walked a slow circle around my camp, pausing every few feet to listen. The voices shifted direction when I moved, as if always just out of reach, just beyond the edge of the light. Then, somewhere in the dark, laughter, childlike, high and airy. It sent a chill down my spine. That's when I noticed the temperature had dropped even further. My breath billowed like smoke. Frost was beginning to form along the inner wall of the tent. My boots crunched faintly in the grass. I shined the flashlight down and saw ice blooming across the earth in thin, spiraling patterns like veins or roots. I crouched and touched the ground. It was dry. Still, the frost was spreading. I backed into the tent, zipped it shut, and buried myself in my sleeping bag, headphones in, white noise on, volume up. I couldn't block it all out. The voices kept bleeding through half-formed sentences and fragmented names I didn't recognize. One voice whispered a phrase I'll never forget. "You've come too far. You're not supposed to be here." And then silence again. Not peace silence, the kind that presses against your skin, the kind that feels deliberate. I must have drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, because the next thing I remember was waking just before dawn. The voices were gone. The frost had receded. The air still felt wrong, but there was a hint of birdsong, distant and tentative, as if even the wildlife was unsure it was safe to speak. I stepped out into the morning light, and the meadow looked just as it had the night before, calm/still, beautiful, except my tent had moved, only slightly, maybe 2 feet from where I'd staked it, but the stakes were still in the ground, now stretched tight at odd angles. I checked the area. No footprints, no animal tracks, nothing to suggest someone or something had dragged it. But something had. I decided I wouldn't stay another night out here. I would push toward the main trail, even if it meant cutting across uncharted terrain. I just needed to feel like I was making progress again, like I was headed away from whatever I'd stumbled into. I packed up quickly. No breakfast, no lingering. Before leaving the meadow, I took one last look around and saw something I hadn't noticed before. On the far edge of the clearing, where the grass thinned into stone and shadow, there was a tree, taller than the others, blackened as if struck by lightning. Its bark peeled away in spirals. Carved into its trunk, nearly 6 feet high, was a symbol, a circle bisected by a jagged line with an eye etched at its center. It wasn't natural, and it hadn't been there the day before. I stared at it for a long time. The longer I looked, the more it felt like it was staring back. I left without touching it. The forest beyond the meadow was tighter, the air heavier. Branches hung lower, as if trying to corral me back. I moved quickly, not running, but close. My breathing stayed steady, but every step was a negotiation with my body, my mind, and with whatever was watching from the shadows. By midday, I stopped to rest beside a creek. That's when I saw it again. The man, standing across the water, still pale, the same from 2 days before. But B didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched, and then, slowly, he raised his hand, not to wave, but to point. Behind me, when I looked back across the creek, he was gone. Not a sound, not a single ripple in the water where he'd stood. I don't remember the next few hours clearly. I just remember walking, fast, focused, like a thread pulling me forward through the trees. At some point, I passed a deer, carcass fresh, no smell yet. Its legs were broken in ways that didn't make sense. Its neck twisted completely around, but there were no bite marks, no blood, just placed. Like a message, I didn't stop. By sunset, I'd reached a ridge I didn't recognize. No trail markers, no familiar topography. I should have been heading west, but the sun was setting behind me, which meant I was going the wrong way. I sat down, took out the map, double-checked the compass. It spun, not erratically, not wildly, but it spun, as if unsure where north was. I tried my GPS. Dead. No signal, no battery. Despite being at full charge that morning, I sat there until the light faded, and as the stars blinked into view, I noticed something terrible. They weren't where they were supposed to be. Or rather, I wasn't. I don't know how to explain it. The constellations were almost right, like a puzzle, put together by someone who didn't quite know the picture. The Big Dipper curved too far. Orion's belt had an extra star. The moon was lower, dimmer. The air had that strange hush again, like I was standing in a version of the world that hadn't finished loading. I camped under the open sky anyway, unwilling to go back into the trees, and just before I fell asleep, I heard the voices again. Only this time, they were behind my eyes. Section 10. The hollow place. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my back, under the too-wide sky, watching stars I didn't recognize drift overhead. The voices behind my eyes never faded completely. They didn't speak in words, exactly, more like impressions, echoes of things I almost understood. Sometimes they seemed curious, other times hungry. By dawn, I felt hollow, not tired, just emptied, like something had reached into me during the night and taken something small but important. I packed up without thinking, like my hands were moving on autopilot. Compass still useless, GPS still blank, but something was guiding me, now not direction, exactly pull. Like gravity in reverse, as if I was being drawn to something I didn't want to find. By mid-morning, the trees grew strange. They weren't dead, exactly, but they were off. Their branches knotted in unnatural spirals. Their bark was soft in places, almost like skin. I stopped once to tie my boot and leaned against one without thinking. It felt warm, and when I pulled away, a patch of bark came with me. Beneath it was an eye, not quite animal, just watching. I left it there, pretending I hadn't seen it, and kept walking. Around noon, the forest opened again, but this time, instead of a meadow, I found myself standing at the edge of a shallow basin, wide and grey, filled with ash and the skeletal remains of trees long dead. It stretched out in all directions, maybe a mile across, and utterly silent. I almost turned back, but something told me there was no back anymore. Not really. So I entered the hollow. The ash rose around my boots with every step. There were no tracks, no wind, no birds overhead. I moved quickly but carefully, eyes scanning the horizon for movement. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her, the woman, same dark clothes, same long limbs, same too-still posture. She stood across the basin, on the far ridge, watching. I froze. We stared at each other for a long time. And then, without moving her legs, she vanished. Just gone. Like the moment I acknowledged her, she no longer needed to be there. I didn't follow. I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I turned toward a strange shape rising from the middle of the basin. It looked like a cabin at first, but as I got closer, I realized it was older. Not abandoned, but ancient. A structure built from logs that had petrified over time, grey and splintered, stacked into strange angles. There were no windows, no chimney, just a door, slightly ajar. Of course, I should have walked away, but I didn't. I stepped inside. It was dark, smelled of stone and wet wood, but it was warmer than outside. A single candle flickered on a table in the center of the room, though there was no flame, just glow, like it had been lit by intention alone. There were things on the walls, objects tied in twine, bones, feathers, small stones carved with runes I didn't recognize. But the most disturbing thing in the cabin was the mirror. It hung above the table, framed in rusted iron, and it did not reflect me. Instead, I saw the cabin but wrong. Rotting, twisted, the candle flickered blue. The table was cracked down the middle. The walls were moving, breathing slightly, and in the mirror's corner stood the man, still watching, silent. I turned around, heart hammering. The cabin behind me was empty, but when I looked back at the mirror, he was closer. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the table, and as I did, something whispered right next to my ear. "We remember you." That was enough. I bolted out of the cabin and didn't stop running until the ash was behind me, lungs burning, throat dry. I didn't look back. By dusk, I found another trail. Not on any map. It looked newly made, flattened grasses and broken twigs, leading between two ancient pine trunks. I didn't trust it, but I followed it, because it was going downhill. That night, I made camp in a small ravine near a stream. The water ran clear and fast, and for the first time in days, I let myself hope. Maybe I was close to something familiar. Maybe this was the edge of whatever place I'd stumbled into. But hope is dangerous out here. It blinds you to the signs. I slept fitfully, dreams tangled and loud. I woke at some point to soft footsteps just outside the tent. But when I sat up and held my breath, the sound was gone. Then I heard a whisper, like it came from the stream. "We've missed you." I didn't sleep after that. When the sun rose, the stream had dried up. All that remained was the smooth bed of stones, and on one of those stones, a drawing scratched deep into the surface. That same symbol, circle, jagged line, eye in the center. It was burned into the rock. Fresh, not a day older than the night before. I moved on quickly, every nerve raw and alert. By midday, I crested another ridge, and what I saw froze me in place. Below me was a lake, still black, and at the center of the lake, an island, and on that island, the cabin, same structure, same slanted roof, but this time I could see the woman. She was standing in the doorway, waiting. She raised her hand, not waving, not beckoning, just showing me her palm, and etched into her skin was the same eye, the one that had been watching me since the first night, the one that was now behind my eyes when I closed them. I stepped back from the ridge, and I ran. Section 11. The map with no north. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Even after I pulled the tent flap shut. Even after I buried myself inside my sleeping bag like it was some kind of armor. The shadows never stopped shifting. I'd been hiking for days, and yet that night in particular it felt like the forest was watching me back. At some point, maybe just before dawn, I unzipped the tent, stepped outside, and stretched my legs. Everything was still. The wind, the stars, even the clouds above me. A total, unnatural quiet. It wasn't until I packed up camp and reached the next ridge that I found something strange sticking out of a crack in the granite. It was a rolled piece of canvas dirt caked, weather-worn, and tightly bound with twine. It unrolled into something like a map, but it was unlike any I'd seen before. There were no town names, no topographic lines, no trail markers, and no north. Instead, the map seemed ... personal. Tiny symbols had been etched into its fabric. Circles, crosses, stars, and strange, tree-like shapes. Some had arrows beside them. Others were marked over with what looked like fingerprints in charcoal. In the lower right corner, written in faded but deliberate handwriting, were the words, "You are here, but you shouldn't be." I didn't want to carry it. Something deep in my chest twisted at the idea, but I rolled it back up and stashed it anyway, telling myself that I'd figure out where it led after I reached higher ground. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Time began behaving strangely. I'd check my watch and it'd be just past noon. I'd hike for what felt like 20 minutes and it'd be almost sunset. Then the opposite I'd slog uphill for hours, only to find out I'd barely lost 5 minutes. I chalked it up to altitude, exhaustion, even dehydration. But in truth, I'd been walking in loops. Each time I passed by the same dead tree, a gnarled thing with a hollow center and a set of claw marks running down its bark, I got this awful sense that the forest was folding in on me. The dead tree, the rockslide scar, even the peculiar stump with the melted bottle embedded in it, ... They all repeated, over and over again. By the third time, I sat down and took out the map. Now here's where things get truly weird. The map had changed. Slightly. One of the marks, a crooked triangle near the left edge, was now circled in red. I was certain that hadn't been there before. Beneath the triangle were 3 scratch marks, almost like someone had used the map as a diary. My breath caught as I noticed something else. Right where I found the map, right where I currently sat, someone had sketched a figure, a little human stick figure with arms pointed skyward, and beside it, the words, "Stop calling out, they hear everything." The words hit harder than I'd like to admit, because I had been calling out, sometimes loudly, sometimes just under my breath. Things like, "Is anyone out there?" Or "Hello, I'm lost." Was that what the message meant? They hear everything. I folded the map and kept walking. This time, I ignored my compass and followed the triangle symbol. If someone had circled it, maybe they'd meant to leave a trail. Maybe it was a shelter or a warning. The terrain changed again. Thicker trees, less light. The air took on this syrupy texture, like it was filled with pollen or ash. And then, for the first time in days, I heard music, just a whisper of it. So faint I thought it was in my head. A soft, distant melody. Piano, no rhythm, just a sad improvisation playing out through the branches. I crept closer. The sound grew louder as I passed through 2 rows of half-dead spruce, trees bent inward like an archway. My breath fogged, despite the summer air. The trail ended at what I can only describe as an altar. A circle of stones, charred wood arranged like ribs, and a tape recorder placed at the center. Still worried. The music was coming from the tape. I crouched, suddenly aware of how far I'd strayed. I picked up the recorder and pressed stop. Immediately, the forest fell silent. I pressed rewind, curious, and then hit play again. Only this time, I didn't hear piano. I heard a voice. My voice, repeating things I hadn't said into any microphone. Not consciously, it said, "I don't know where I am." The map changed again. The trees are closer today than yesterday. I haven't seen the sun in hours, and I think I heard something breathing outside the tent last night. I'm sure I dropped it, let it hit the dirt. How could it know my thoughts? Was this some trick? Had someone been following me? Had they bugged me? Or was I slowly losing it? I backed away. The world wobbled under my feet, and then, in my periphery, I caught sight of something standing at the tree line. Tall, pale, not moving, not blinking, just watching. I didn't stay to look. I grabbed the map, the recorder, and I ran. Not downhill, not uphill, just away. Anywhere. My pack got lighter, or maybe I just stopped noticing its weight. The forest howled and wheezed around me, but nothing chased me. At least, not that I could see. Still, the trees grew thicker, tighter, and the trail less and less distinguishable. When I finally stopped, heart hammering, lungs aching, I found myself next to a wooden sign, so weathered I could barely read it. It said, "Warning. You have entered an uncharted region. Proceed at your own risk." Below it, a newer sign had been crudely nailed on, in red paint. Maps lie. That night, I burned a small fire. The recorder stayed silent. I didn't dare listen again. The map lay rolled up by my side. I tried to sleep. I almost succeeded until I heard what sounded like paper tearing, but not from my map. It was coming from the trees, and somewhere behind me, something whispered. Wrong way. Section 12. The signal. By the time I found the tower, I had stopped expecting to be surprised. The forest had twisted around my sense of reality so tightly that even when I stumbled upon something as modern and impossible as a radio tower, I didn't feel hope. Just a dim sense of recognition, like I had seen it in a dream I hadn't realized I was having. The tower stood crooked, half devoured by vines and rust, its blinking red light pulsing through the fog like a dying heartbeat. It was tall, skeletal, and utterly out of place among the pines. But there it was, cutting a jagged line into the sky. At first, I just stared at it. I must have stood there for 10 full minutes, too afraid to approach. I could hear something hum, a low mechanical vibration that buzzed somewhere behind my teeth. It wasn't just the tower. It was in me, or maybe through me, like my body had become a tuning fork, and this place had found the right frequency to make me resonate. Still, I walked closer. Not far from the tower's base, I found a cabin, or maybe a control shed. It was hard to tell. The wood was warped and blackened, as though it had been struck by lightning at some point and left to rot. The door was slightly ajar. A faint yellow light leaked through the cracks. Even though I could see no wires, no power source, the sign above the door had mostly peeled away. But the letters that remained read: Wilderness Relay Station 51, nitrogen monox, public access inside. The air was cold, stale, but charged, like the air just before a thunderstorm. There was a desk, a wall lined with filing cabinets, a row of ancient equipment radios, speakers, each one blinking lazily to life as I entered, like they'd just woken from a long sleep. The largest radio was still powered. Somehow, its screen glowed faint green. Its dials were active, and behind the static, there was something else. I sat down in front of it. Slowly, cautiously, my fingers hovered above the tuning knob. A part of me said, "Don't touch it." Another part whispered, "You've already been heard." I turned the dial anyway. For a few moments, It was nothing but white noise, a hiss, constant and deep, like an ocean storm trapped inside a bottle. Then, without warning, a voice crackled through. If you are receiving this transmission, you are already inside the perimeter. Do not attempt to leave on foot. Do not follow your compass. Do not follow the lights. The voice was male.com. But not human. Comet was like it had been repeating this message for years, for decades, maybe for centuries. I kept listening. You may experience time loss. You may encounter doppelgangers. Do not engage. Do not trust auditory hallucinations, especially those that resemble voices of loved ones. And then a pause, a much longer one. The static returned, louder this time. Then, a new voice. This one was familiar. It was my own. If you find this place, stop, turn around, burn the map. Don't climb the hill, don't go near the water. And whatever you do, don't touch the radio. It's listening, even when it's silent. My stomach turned cold. I backed away. The chair tipped and clattered to the floor. My voice kept playing from the radio, repeating instructions I never gave, warnings I hadn't spoken aloud, except I remembered speaking them. A campfire, maybe 3 nights back, half asleep, talking into the dark. Not to anything in particular, just letting the fear fall out of me in half-formed sentences. Someone or something had heard. That's when the lights flickered. The static cut out. The room went dead quiet. Then a sharp, high-pitched tone screamed from the radio, rising until it felt like it was vibrating behind my eyes. I covered my ears and stumbled outside, desperate to get away from that sound. Outside, the forest was darker than it had been. The sun gone, no twilight. Just a full and instant night. And directly beneath the tower's steel frame, something had appeared. A hole about the size of a manhole cover. Round, clean, edges perfect, as though laser cut into the forest floor. It pulsed with a dim red glow, the same color as the tower's beacon above. And from it, I heard breathing. Not just air moving in and out, but intentional breath, measured, deliberate. Watching, I didn't go near it. I ran. I didn't stop until I collapsed hours later. At least, I think it was hours. Could have been minutes, could have been days. The forest was different again. The trees were younger, shorter. The air smelled clean, untouched. I wasn't sure if I had escaped that tower, or if I'd crossed into something even worse. As I lay there, catching my breath, I unfolded the map. A new mark had appeared right where the tower had been. It was labeled The Mouth, and next to it, a handwritten note I knew I hadn't written. Transmission received. Thank you for coming home. Section 13. Trail of teeth. When I woke, the forest was silent again. Not the usual kind of silence, no birds, no breeze, no insects. This was thicker, denser, a silence that pressed in on my skin like humidity. I sat up slowly, expecting to find myself back near the tower, or maybe beside that strange breathing hole in the earth. But everything around me looked new. The trees were slimmer, the bark pale, almost silvery, their branches curled in unnatural shapes, bending not toward the sun but away from something I hadn't seen yet. The trail ahead was clear, too clear. Someone or something had swept the ground. No leaves, no pine needles, just packed dirt, and what looked like a straight line of pale stones leading forward, one every 6 feet. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't stones. They were teeth, human molars. Some yellowed, some cracked, all of them rooted into the trail like tiny fence posts, perfectly aligned, each one pointing the same direction. My body screamed to turn around. My feet did not listen. I kept walking. About 20 minutes in, I noticed something else. Along the sides of the trail, where moss should have been growing, there were strips of torn cloth. Blue, brown, a flash of red. Some had patons of flannel square here, a sleeve cuff there. All of it looked old, weather-eaten, like someone had walked this path before me, losing bits of themselves along the way. And then came the carvings. At first, I only saw one, etched deep into the bark of a birch tree to my left. It followed me here. Then another, maybe 30 feet ahead. Do not look back. It shows you yourself, and further still. I forgot my name. Don't let it take yours. The air got colder. The trees grew denser, crowding closer, until I couldn't see the sky at all. There was no wind, just that same low-frequency hum I'd felt back at the radio tower, soft, barely audible, but pressing against my chest like gravity. Eventually, the teeth trail ended at a clearing. At the center stood a wooden post. Tied to the post was a photograph, sealed in a crumbling plastic sleeve. It was a picture of me. Not recent me. Me at age 5 or 6, wearing a blue jacket I barely remembered owning, standing in a sandbox, smiling wide. I stared at it for too long, long enough to notice the background wasn't familiar. Not my old neighborhood, not a park I recognized, just trees. These trees, the ones around me now. Had I been here before? Had I forgotten? The post had something else carved into it, right beneath the photo. You left. But it never did. I backed away slowly. That's when I heard it. A single click, like a twig snapping. Then another. Then dozens. I turned and looked up the path behind me. The teeth, every single one, had rotated. They now pointed backward, not forward like before. Backward. Toward me. I didn't wait. I ran down a side path, away from the teeth, into the thicker part of the woods. The trees clawed at me, snagging my clothes, but I didn't stop. I could hear something moving behind me, not fast, but steady, deliberate. Crunch, 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 like boots in gravel or bone against bark. I scrambled through underbrush, over rocks, until I reached a narrow gully. At the bottom, something glittered. I slid down the slope and landed beside an old steel door buried in the hillside. No lock, no handle, just rusted hinges and a square of darkness. I looked behind me. Nothing, no movement, no sound. But the trail of teeth had returned, now planted at the top of the slope. Watching, waiting, I opened the door and stepped inside. The darkness swallowed me. The room was larger than expected. Concrete walls, moss-covered, an old bunker, maybe a fallout shelter. I couldn't tell. There was a generator in the corner, dead a row of lockers, a cot, and carved into the wall, just above the cot, in what looked like dried blood. If you find this, stay until morning. I sat down, breathing hard. Then I noticed the scrapbook. It was tucked beneath the cot, leather-bound, thick, sealed with a cord. I undid the knot and flipped it open. Photos, pages of them, all of me. Me hiking, me sleeping in my tent, me writing in my journal, some of them taken from impossible angles overhead, behind trees, even through the tent wall. I flipped faster, heart racing. Me as a kid, me on a school bus, me crying in the woods, page after page after page, until the last image, a photo of the bunker I was sitting in, taken from just outside the open steel door. The photo was fresh, the ink still wet. I closed the book tight, and in the silence that followed, I heard something knock. Not from the door, from beneath the floorboards. Just once. Then again, Then it started scraping, a slow, dragging sound beneath the concrete, like something with too many arms was crawling its way up. I didn't scream, I didn't run, I just sat there, clutching the scrapbook, listening, waiting. Section 14. Beneath the floorboards. The scraping beneath the floorboards didn't stop. It was slow and uneven, like claws or fingers dragging a crosswood that had been here longer than I had. I sat frozen, every nerve screaming, the leather-bound scrapbook pressed tightly to my chest like a shield. Minutes passed, or was it hours? Time lost meaning in that concrete bunker. The darkness felt alive. Then, from somewhere deep below, came a whisper. Not a voice I could understand, but a sound, soft, like breath against my ear. The sound of something breathing in rhythm with the scraping. I told myself it was just the wind through the cracks, but the air was still. No wind could come here. The floor beneath me groaned. I slowly stood and took a hesitant step, then another. The sound followed. I edged toward the door, every step reverberating in the quiet bunker. Then, from behind, the floorboards cracked. A narrow fissure opened near my feet. Darkness spilled from it like ink. I almost stumbled back, but my eyes were drawn to that black opening. Something moved inside. A flicker, a pulse. I reached out to the edge of the crack. The air was icy, cold, colder than anything I'd felt outside, even in the Canadian winter. I pressed my hand closer, and the whispering became louder. Not words, but fragments. Find, remember. He waits. You are next. Then the crack widened, and a pale, skeletal hand emerged. It was thin and covered in dirt, the fingers long and crooked, with nails like shards of glass. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen. The hand curled upward and grasped the edge of the floor. Then, slowly, a face appeared. Not human. Not quite. The eyes were deep black pits. The skin stretched tight over the bones, grey and cracked like old parchment. Its mouth opened not to speak, but to reveal rows of tiny, sharp teeth. And then it smiled. I stumbled backward, heart pounding in my ears. The face vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The crack closed with a final, echoing snap. The bunker was silent again. I didn't wait. I burst through the steel door and ran into the forest. Branches tore at my clothes, and my lungs burned with cold air. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, where the sun was just beginning to rise. But even in the light, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Hours later, back at my car, I found something on the passenger seat. A single human tooth. Section 15. The tooth and the trail. The tooth sat cold and heavy in my palm, its surface chipped and stained by time. I didn't know what it meant, but something about it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a human tooth. It looked older, worn, maybe even unnatural. I tried to reason it away. Maybe it belonged to some animal, but no. It was definitely human. And it hadn't been there before I left the bunker. How did it get there? Had it been planted? A warning? Or something worse? I tucked it into my jacket pocket and stared out at the trailhead. The forest seemed peaceful now, but I knew better. This place was alive with secrets and danger. Back on the trail, my mind raced. Why had I come here? What was I really searching for? Was it my father? Answers? Or was it something deeper? Something buried beneath layers of silence and shadows? I shook my head and pushed forward. The path twisted through dense pines, the morning sun filtering through like thin shards of light. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the woods were pressing in on me. The silence was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. Then I saw it. A small cairn of stones, stacked awkwardly beside the trail. I hadn't noticed it on the way in. Someone had built it recently. Or maybe it had been there all along. I stepped closer, my breath misting in the cool air. At the base, a scrap of faded cloth was tied around a stone. The fabric was worn, frayed, and stained dark. I reached out, but hesitated. This was a marker, a sign that I wasn't alone here. Maybe a warning, maybe a memorial. The trail forked shortly after, one path leading deeper into the forest, the other sloping down toward a small creek. Instinct told me to follow the creek. Water often meant signs of life. I moved quietly, careful not to disturb the underbrush. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound. Not quite human, but definitely not natural. A low, rhythmic thudding, echoing through the trees. I froze. The sound was close. Closer than I liked. I crept forward, the sound growing louder. Then I saw it. A figure hunched beside the creek. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I watched, the figure lifted its head. Its eyes caught the light, glowing faintly, a deep amber. It stared at me for a long moment. Not hostile, but watchful. Then it turned and disappeared into the undergrowth. I stood there, heart pounding, wondering what I'd just seen. Was it a person, or something else entirely? The forest held its breath. I decided to follow cautiously. For the next hour, I trailed the figure through thick brush and over mossy rocks. The creature moved swiftly but silently, like it was part of the forest itself. Eventually, it stopped near a small clearing. In the center stood a weathered wooden cross, half covered in moss. Around it were scattered small objects. Stones, feathers, and what looked like old photographs. The air here was heavy, thick, with a strange energy. I knelt beside the cross and picked up one of the photos. It was faded, but I could just make out the faces of a young man and woman, smiling, happy. It reminded me painfully of the scrapbook I carried. I couldn't help but wonder, who had placed this shrine here, and why? As I stood to leave, I heard the soft crunch of leaves behind me. I turned sharply. No one was there, only the forest. But I knew I wasn't alone. I hurried back to my car, the weight of what I'd seen pressing down on me. That night, I studied the tooth again. Something about it pulled at the edges of my memory. A fragment of a story, half remembered. The search wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Section 16. The cabin in the pines the next morning. The mist still clung low to the forest floor as I packed my gear into the car. The tooth weighed heavily in my pocket, a grim reminder of the mystery I was entangled in. I knew I needed answers, but I also knew that the woods wouldn't give them up easy. I had heard whispers about an old cabin hidden deep in the pines, a place locals rarely spoke of, but one rumored to hold clues about the strange disappearances and secrets of the area. Some said it was abandoned. Others whispered it belonged to a hermit who knew more than he let on. Driving along the narrow dirt road, the trees closed in around me, their branches arching like silent sentinels. The air was crisp, filled with a scent of pine and damp earth. After about an hour, I reached a fork in the road marked by a faded wooden sign that read simply, "Whisper Pines." The name sent a chill through me, but I turned right and pressed onward. The road quickly deteriorated, becoming little more than a rutted path covered in fallen needles and small stones. I slowed, carefully picking my way through potholes and twisted roots. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where the cabin stood, half hidden by towering firs. It was a simple structure, weathered wood, a crooked chimney, and windows clouded with years of grime. The porch sagged slightly, and the door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. The forest was eerily silent here. Even the usual morning birdsong seemed to have vanished. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of my boots on dry leaves loud in the stillness. Approaching the cabin, I noticed a faded circle of stones beside the porch. Maybe a fire pit, long unused. The air smelled faintly of smoke, but there was no sign of recent activity. I pushed the door open with a slow creak. Inside, the cabin was small and dimly lit by the soft morning light filtering through the grimy windows. Dust motes floated in the air like tiny spirits. Old furniture cluttered the room, a sagging armchair, a rickety table scattered with papers and books, and a battered trunk against the far wall. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. I moved carefully, eyes scanning the scattered papers. Most were yellowed and brittle maps, notes, some hand-drawn sketches of the surrounding wilderness. One page caught my attention, a crudely drawn map marked with strange symbols and lines, with Hunter's Rock and Sawtooth lands labeled prominently. I pulled it out gently, tracing the faded ink with my finger. Was this the work of my father? Had he been here? The trunk beckoned next. It was locked, but the rusty old padlock gave way with little effort. Inside, I found a handful of personal items: an old leather-bound journal, a worn hat, and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Unwrapping the bundle, I discovered a collection of stones, some polished and others rough, along with a silver locket engraved with initials I didn't recognize. The journal, however, was what held me. Its pages were filled with dense handwriting, sometimes neat, sometimes frantic. I settled on the dusty floor and began to read. The journal belonged to someone named Elias, an explorer and self-proclaimed protector of the forest. Elias wrote about strange happenings in the area, sudden disappearances, eerie lights in the night, and a growing darkness creeping through the woods. He believed there was something ancient buried beneath the earth, a force older than time, watching, waiting. His last entries grew more desperate. He wrote of voices calling to him in the wind and shadows that moved just beyond sight. One entry ended abruptly. They come for the blood. They hunger still. I can hear the howling. If this is my last entry, know that the forest is not what it seems. A shiver ran down my spine as I closed the journal. I wondered if Elias was the hermit everyone whispered about, or something else entirely. What had happened to him? I had more questions than answers. I tucked the journal carefully into my pack and stepped back outside. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows through the trees. As I looked around the clearing, a sudden rustle caught my attention. I turned quickly, heart pounding. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, a man, tall and gaunt, with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me. He didn't speak. Instead, he nodded once, sharply, then melted back into the trees. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure if I had imagined it. Was Elias still out here, watching? Or was it something else, something not quite human? With the journal in hand and the tooth still heavy in my pocket, I realized that this journey was far from over. I climbed back into my car and started the engine, the forest closing behind me like a secret waiting to be uncovered. That night, I lay awake, thinking about the cabin, Elias's words echoing in my mind. The forest was alive with mysteries, but the more I uncovered, the more I felt drawn deeper into a story far older and darker than I had imagined. And somewhere, out there in the Rockies, the truth was waiting. Section 17. The Whispering Winds. The following morning dawned pale and cool. The sky a soft wash of grey through the thick canopy of pines. The forest seemed to hold its breath, if waiting for something to happen. I drove back toward the main trail, clutching the journal and the tooth tightly in my pack. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp moss and fallen leaves. As I walked along the winding path, a soft breeze began to stir the branches overhead. The wind wasn't like any ordinary breeze. It carried with it faint whispers, words I couldn't quite catch, but sounds that felt familiar, like half-remembered dreams. I paused, closing my eyes, listening. The whispers seemed to ebb and flow with the wind's rhythm, soft and teasing. Sometimes they sounded like laughter, other times like distant cries. I tried to focus, straining to decipher what the forest was trying to say. Was it warning me, guiding me, or simply playing tricks on my mind? The trees swayed gently, their needles shimmering as the light shifted. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange calm settle over me. As I walked deeper into the woods, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around, swirling through the branches and settling in the leaves at my feet. I followed the sound, letting it guide me through the thick underbrush and over mossy logs. Eventually, I reached a small clearing, bathed in soft sunlight. In the center stood an ancient stone, half covered in lichen. Its surface was carved with symbols, some familiar, others strange and twisting like the roots of the trees themselves. I approached the stone carefully. The whispers grew louder here, almost like voices speaking just beneath the surface of sound. I reached out and touched the cool, rough surface. A sudden shiver ran through me, as if the stone held a memory, a story waiting to be told. The symbol seemed to pulse softly under my fingertips. I closed my eyes and let myself sink into the moment. Images flickered behind my eyelids, a dense forest, shadowed figures moving silently, a fire burning bright against the night. I saw faces, ancient and weathered eyes, full of knowledge and sorrow. The whispers became clearer snatches of language I didn't understand, but that felt somehow meaningful. The stone was a link, a connection to something old and powerful. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was still. The whispers faded, leaving only the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I felt different, like I had touched something beyond the ordinary, something that belonged to the forest itself. I took a step back, reluctant to leave the stone behind, but the trail called, and I knew I had to keep moving. As I made my way back through the trees, I thought about the stories hidden in this place, about the lives lived and lost here, the mysteries buried beneath the earth and whispered on the wind. I felt both small and part of something much larger. The forest was alive, and it was watching. That night, the whispers stayed with me. Soft murmurs just beyond hearing, like the forest was speaking in its own secret language. I fell asleep, wondering what other secrets waited to be uncovered, and if I was ready to hear them. Section 18. The Forgotten Cabin. The morning sun filtered softly through the mist as I set out again, following a narrow, winding trail that seemed almost hidden beneath the fallen needles and moss. I had no clear destination in mind, just a sense, a pull deeper into the forest. About an hour's walk in, I came across something unexpected. A cabin. It was small and weathered, almost swallowed by the surrounding trees and brush. The roof sagged under years of snow and rain. The wood was dark and cracked, with vines creeping up its sides. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking gently as the breeze slipped through. I hesitated for a moment, the air heavy with the scent of earth and old wood. Something about the place felt familiar, like a forgotten memory tucked away in the shadows of the forest. Slowly, I stepped closer. Inside, the cabin was dim, but not empty. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light that slipped through cracks in the walls. There was a faint smell of smoke, and the remnants of a long cold fire still sat in the stone hearth. A rickety table held a few scattered objects. An old tin cup, a folded piece of paper yellowed with age, and a faded photograph. I picked up the photograph carefully. It showed a family standing in front of the cabin. A man, a woman, and a small child. They wore heavy coats and looked as if they had braved many winters. Their faces were solemn, eyes staring directly at the camera. Something about the photo tugged at me, a quiet sadness. The folded paper caught my attention next. It was a letter written in delicate script. The ink was faded but still legible. It spoke of hardship and hope, of waiting for someone who never came home. The writer described the wilderness around the cabin, the silence, the beauty, and the loneliness. As I read, a story unfolded, a story of isolation, love, and loss. The cabin had once been a refuge from the world, a place to escape and to wait. But time had moved on, and the people who had lived here had vanished like whispers in the wind. I felt a deep connection to the place, as if the cabin was a vessel for stories waiting to be told. Outside, the forest stood still, watching and listening. I sat quietly for a while, letting the silence settle around me like a gentle blanket. Eventually, I rose and stepped back outside. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint echoes of the past. I knew I would return to this place to uncover more of its secrets and to listen to the stories it held. That night, beneath a sky full of stars, I lay in my tent thinking about the cabin, about the people who had lived there, their hopes and their sorrows, and about the endless mystery of the forest, forever whispering its tales to those who listen. Section 19. The echoes of the past. The morning air was cool and crisp as I packed up my camp. The soft rustle of leaves and distant bird calls filling the quiet. I felt a weight in my chest. The kind of weight that comes from carrying too many unanswered questions. The forest around me was dense, shadows stretching long in the early light. I started walking toward a narrow trail I hadn't explored yet, one that curled gently along a ridge. The ground beneath my boots was soft, the scent of pine and earth grounding me in the present. Even as my mind wandered back to the stories I'd uncovered, as I walked, the trees seemed to whisper. Not the same soft, unintelligible murmurs from before, but something deeper, like the forest itself was trying to tell me something important. I paused often, turning my head as if listening for a voice carried on the wind. The trail led me to a small clearing, and in the center stood an old stone foundation, barely visible beneath a blanket of moss and fallen leaves. It was clear that this was once a home, but now only the stones remained, silent and stoic. I knelt beside the foundation and traced the edges with my fingers, imagining the walls that once stood here. I thought about the people who might have lived in this place, their hopes, their struggles, the lives they led in this remote wilderness. The solitude of this place was palpable. It was easy to imagine how isolation could weigh heavy on the heart and mind. As the day wore on, I sat quietly by the stones, letting my thoughts drift. I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, the twists and turns, the fleeting glimpses of answers, and the lingering mysteries that still clung to the shadows. The forest around me felt alive with memories. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call seemed like an echo from the past, and in those echoes I found a strange comfort. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the trees, I packed up once more. The path ahead was uncertain, but I felt a quiet resolve settling within me. There was more to discover, more stories to uncover, and I was ready to keep searching. That night, beneath a sky full of stars, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest, the gentle rustling of the wind, the distant call of an owl. The wilderness was vast and mysterious, but I was no longer afraid. I was a part of its story now. Section 20. The last night the air had taken on a chill as twilight deepened, and the forest around me seemed to hold its breath. I had made camp near a gentle stream, the water murmuring softly as it wound its way through the trees. The sound was soothing, like a lullaby sung by the earth itself. I settled down by the fire, its flames flickering quietly against the encroaching darkness. There was a stillness here that felt sacred, as if the forest was wrapping me in a protective embrace. I thought about the journey I had taken, the people I'd met, the stories I'd heard, and the memories I'd uncovered. Tonight felt like an ending, but also a beginning, an invitation to rest, to reflect, and to let go of the burdens I had carried for so long. I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the crisp mountain air. Memories of my father, the missing girl, the forgotten cabin, and the endless wilderness all swirled together, each one a thread in the tapestry of this journey, a tapestry woven with mystery, loss, hope, and discovery. As darkness settled fully, I let myself drift, carried by the quiet sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the gentle rush of the stream, all weaving a soothing symphony, perfect for easing the mind and lulling the body toward sleep. And as I lay there beneath the vast canopy of stars, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, I had found something important here. Not just answers, but peace. With that thought, I finally let the last of my worries fade away. The forest held its watch, and I fell asleep, cradled by the quiet, mysterious wilderness.